Welcome to the latest episode of the Working Wellbeings podcast. This episode was recorded in March 2023, where Alethea and I had the pleasure of speaking with Chris Jones, who's the Chief Safety and Wellbeing Officer at the Department of Corrections in New Zealand. I first met Chris when he worked as Head of Occupational Health and Wellbeing Strategy at Network Rail nearly a decade ago. The time has flown. At the time, the thing that really struck me about Chris was his long-term approach that he was trying to take with well-being in the business. So he actually had a 10-year well-being strategy he was working on, which I hadn't seen any other organisations do before. Now, he actually talks about this strategy in the podcast and how he thinks, on reflection, maybe a 10-year plan may have been a bit optimistic and naive. But for me, he hasn't lost any of that strategic focus. As everything that he talks about in the podcast is about how you can enhance health, safety and well-being within organisations over the long term. As usual with the Working Wellbeings podcast, Chris walks us through his career path from humble beginnings as a personal trainer with an interest in physiology to a place on the executive board of the prison service in New Zealand and everything in between. But the bit I really hope you tune in to listen to is when he talks about well-being and complex systems thinking. So Chris asked the question, how do we design workplaces where well-being is the outcome rather than harm? Simple as that. But then he talks about how complex systems thinking and emergent phenomena can help with this, about how there are unexpected outcomes that emerge from how an organisation or system interacts dynamically. And well-being can be an outcome of this system. You can't say one thing will enhance well-being. You can't just say, right, let's just do this and it'll build well-being. Actually, well-being is the outcome of myriad different factors all interacting with one another. And he uses, I'm going to steal one of his quotes here. He uses this quote. He says, safety is an outcome of work going well, and well-being is an outcome of work being experienced well. And it's the first time, again, I've heard safety and well-being being talked about in that particular way. It was really, really fascinating. So actually, he tells us a little bit about how he actually manages that on an executive level, how he spends time speaking to the finance director, chief people officer, all these sorts of roles, really to empathise with different parts of the business. So if you're currently in a role, where perhaps you are on the executive team within an organisation looking after well-being, or that's your aspiration, this is definitely one to listen to. So anyway, I won't steal any more of Chris's thunder. Enjoy the podcast. Right then, so welcome everybody. Welcome back to the Working Wellbeings podcast. Great to have you all here. Today I'm really excited to introduce our next podcaster, interviewee. What do you call him? I'm not sure. But Chris Jones. So Chris is the Chief Safety and Wellbeing Officer at Department of Corrections in New Zealand. So this is our first truly global session that we're running. So really looking forward to that. So Chris, we actually met, we were saying nearly a decade ago, right? When I was working, in a previous life for another organisation, and you were at, was it Network Rail at the time?
Yeah, Network Rail in the UK.
Yeah, so Network Rail, and you were head of, I don't know your title back then. Were you head of wellbeing or head of health and safety and wellbeing?
Occupational health and wellbeing, I was head of.
Okay. So we were trying to work. I remember at the time we were trying to work out a 10-year strategy for Network Rail as to how they could improve well-being. So I guess we're nearly up to 10 years. So they must have realised that, right?
Yeah, I may have set looking back, it was clearly one of those strategies that sets this over aspirational vision of what can genuinely be achieved in 10 years. Yeah. And I think what's been really nice is the strategy seems to have endured, which is one measure of success. But whether they will have achieved the various aspirations, I imagine naively back then, is probably a different question.
It's probably because you're not there, Chris. That'll be why.
Oh, I doubt that very much.
Anyway, to kick us off, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit? I guess, as this podcast is about learning about, lifting the lid on the real stories of wellbeing leaders and how they got to where they got to, almost right at the beginning, the start, what brought you into this line of work? What's your background and where do you find yourself now?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one I've spoken to quite a few people about. So I think my career into wellbeing actually starts probably with an interest in being fit and healthy myself, and led to me wanting to work and be a personal trainer. And so I studied for a degree in Southampton in health and fitness, and And then I got to the end of my bachelor's and I was thinking, oh my God, there's actually no real jobs out there for me. And I'd already been working in the gym for a few years. And I thought, I'm not totally sure that's for me. And went on to do a master's in exercise nutrition science in Chester. And luckily, just as I was coming to the end of that, and I was panicking about having this big postgraduate debt that I had to pay back and not totally sure I'd go to actually earn money for it, Nuffield Health were looking to revolutionize the way that they did corporate medical assessments. And so they recruited about 40 health, exercise, nutrition science grads to come and be health physiologists, health and wellbeing physiologists, who were to work alongside doctors doing corporate medical assessments and giving lifestyle coaching advice. And I was given the role of the lead physiologist at the South Coast. So my job was partly running medical assessments, giving lifestyle advice and nutrition advice and coaching people on how to sleep better and feel better. And also to oversee the clinical and professional standards of the South Coast physiologists. And that was I'd say that was the first real step into genuine well-being coaching. And there's a guy there who's the head of physiology at the time, who's an absolute inspiration in this field, called Ollie Patrick. And he coached us all through what well-being was versus the more traditional medical model of health. And that really kickstarted a passion in me that, well-being isn't the absence of feeling bad or being unwell. It's this very different positive state of being. And that for me was a real kind of game changer in my realization about what well-being could be. And I spent a few years there, and over a few years, Ollie moved on to bigger and better things. And I moved up to be professional head of physiology. So oversaw the national team of probably about 100 physiologists at that point. And I did a lot of stuff around professional development, quality assurance, research, consulting to big firms on their employee wellbeing strategy. And then I started a master's degree in organizational well-being. So I'd started to kind of come to this realization that individual well-being was really, really important, but was always going to be limited if people were working in environments that were actually making it really hard to live a well life. So, they could try their hardest, and yet they were always coming back to me year in, year out for coaching and saying, well, I'm trying really hard, but I work, 70-hour a week, or I can't actually go and get something healthy. And it really kick-started in me this interest in organizational well-being, which is how does the environment a person works within, how does that influence someone's well-being? So I went to Lancaster and I was doing a master's there. And then as I was working through that, Network Rail approached me and said, hey, we want to do well-being, want to do something different to what we're currently doing. What do you think about coming to work for us? And so I went and joined them as head of occupational health and wellbeing strategy. And that was a really, really great move for me professionally and personally. But what was really interesting is it, once again, almost like what I went through with Ollie opening my eyes to what wellbeing is, when I stepped into Network Rail on almost the very first day, I met with their independent regulator. So they have an organization who exists just to regulate the railways. And their head of occupational health as the inspectorate was essentially telling me, your organization is really hurting people. So, she's telling me about you're exposing them to noise and to dust and all these things. And I was there just thinking, hey, I've come in to talk about well-being and what we can do to make people feel better. And you're talking to me about this harm that can occur. And so it really helped me realize that alongside this concept of organizations can be good for people's well-being, it actually opened my eyes to organizations, if they're not set up correctly, can actually harm people's well-being as well. It can harm people's health. And so that kind of kickstarted a real interest in how do we design work in a way that health and well-being is the outcome that's most likely, as opposed to harm that is more likely. Fast forward a few years, you and I worked together, Matt, which was awesome. Took a lot from you actually, and Kerry Cooper during that time. That was really inspirational. And then made a move out to New Zealand to work for New Zealand's health and safety regulator. So they were looking for someone to come in, and New Zealand had just enacted, after a major disaster a few years earlier, they just enacted their new health and safety legislation. And the regulator wanted to take a much more strategic approach to occupational or work-related health. And so I got a role, went over there, worked there for a few years. And then a few years later, the Department of Corrections, which is the organization that runs New Zealand's prisons and community corrections operations, they were looking to revolutionize or revitalize the way that they did health, safety, and well-being. And so I took this role on, and that was about 5.5 years or so ago now. So it's quite a long time. It's probably the longest solid role I've had, but it's actually one I really enjoy. So quite a winding journey, but very much started in individual well-being, organizational well-being, occupational health and well-being, and finally for the last 5.5 years, health, safety, and well-being. So it's kind of like this growing concentric circles in my mind, if you like.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so maybe I'm biased because I feel like I've been on a bit of the same journey in the sense that absolutely, my background was as a positive psychologist and then moved a little more into organizational, and then more recently, real interest in the role that health and safety have in this. And I wonder, like I said, I'm biased really, but I wonder whether that is a trend that we'll continue to see in the industry going forward. What do you think in terms of, I don't know, not well-being being subsumed into health and safety, but those two worlds kind of coming together a little more than they were before? I don't know.
Yeah, I certainly see that. I think that's happening. Why do you think that's happening? I think what I've realized over time that's really helped me understand why they fit together so well is that I think the historical view of well-being is that it was stuff that people did. So, we have financial well-being, we have physical well-being, which makes you feel like, okay, well, as long as I sort my money out, then I'll have well-being, or if as long as I exercise, then I'll have well-being. And safety has been viewed in the same way. As long as I have the right PPE, I will be safe. As long as I have been trained, I will be safe. And probably over the last 4 years, as I've been really, really studying hard in this space, what I've been looking at actually is the field of complexity and complex systems thinking. Mm-hmm. And in complexity, one of the characteristics they talk about is this thing of emergent phenomena. So rather than a thing that you can boil down and say, if we do that little bit there, then we will get this outcome, they actually describe these unexpected outcomes that emerge from how a system and the parts of the system interact dynamically. And actually, if you look at it, well-being is an outcome of the system, right? Because you can't ever predict what one thing will improve someone's well-being. Yeah. You can't ever say that the same thing will work in the exact same way. You can't actually say what all the things are that create well-being. You just have a general sense of the stuff that can sometimes affect it. And it's very much the same with safety. So now we know that safety is the outcome of complexity. So you can't say, as long as I train someone or give them the equipment or do this, this, and this. What you can say is, hey, safety is more likely to emerge when these things tend to be present, and it's less likely to emerge when these things tend to be present or absent. And so the reason I think they can fit together really nicely is that if you view both safety and well-being as emergent properties from how the organizational system operates, then actually you can start to see that safety is an outcome of work going well, and well-being is an outcome of work being experienced well. And that's kind of how I describe the two to people. And so I spend a lot of my time these days doing stuff that doesn't intuitively look like safety or well-being. So I spend a lot of my time talking to the chief finance officer about where are we feeling financially pressured. I spend a lot of my time talking to the director of asset maintenance. Where is he feeling like the equipment, maintenance schedule might need to be bumped a little bit? I spend a lot of my time talking to the chief people officer about, okay, what's the leadership level in the organization like, and where are we weak, where are we good? And those things for many people aren't immediately safety or well-being. But it's because I know that if we get our money right, if we get our tools and equipment right, if we get the training right, if we get the leadership right, safety and well-being are more likely to be the outcomes that people experience and observe. And so for me, the two can absolutely coalesce together if you step back from the subject itself, safety or well-being, and instead you see them as outcomes of a system, and you view the role of a well-being leader as being to influence the organizational system. So that's kind of how I've made sense of it in my mind.
That is really interesting. And also, therefore, you can talk, you are talking about the behaviors that leaders within the business exhibit as well, because another I guess, issue in my mind that well-being in particular has had, and well-being leaders have had over the years is, you're responsible for well-being, right? You're responsible for well-being, so you need to make people well, regardless of what this system is doing over here. And therefore, you're always playing catch up, right? You're always playing catch up because you throw in employee assistance programs and benefits at the problem rather than fixing the root cause. Whereas what you're talking about, you can talk to people about their actual behavior. And again, this is, interested in conversations that I think will happen more, which are around, the decisions you're making as leaders, even if you don't see well-being as any part of your role, will influence well-being and safety 3, 6, 9 months down the line, right? In terms of the culture you're creating and all this sort of thing.
But again, and this is why I think a systems mindset is really helpful for well-being leaders and safety leaders, is because what we talk about behaviors, right? We say, if people behave in this way, as if somehow just by giving people knowledge about what a good behavior is or a bad behavior, they will change. Whereas increasingly, I certainly see behaviors are a symptom of how the system is operating. So you can have the best leader in the world who wants to behave in the best way, but if actually they're getting a ton of pressure down from the top and a ton of pressure up from the bottom, and they don't have the time or the resources, you've got a great human being whose behavior may not reflect what you would ideally see from them, not because they don't care, but actually because the system is making it really difficult for them to show up in the way that you want. Or if your goals, if the organizational goals, even if they're implicit, are make money, deliver on time, well, don't be surprised then if you inadvertently sacrifice safety or sacrifice people's well-being to achieve them. That again doesn't make you a bad person. That makes you and your behaviors a symptom of the system you work within. So if you can influence the system and focus less on the direct behaviors that you're after, then the behaviors themselves will start to emerge from those things. And I was listening to a video on the way into work today, actually, because my chief exec and I were talking about it last night. And the guy was talking about organizational culture, and it was really, he used this phrase that is exactly what I agree with, but it was nicely encapsulated. And he said, you can't design and build culture. It emerges from the interactions between people and teams. And again, it's that concept of emergence, that culture is, again, it's an emergent thing. So rather than trying to design behaviors or design culture and say, hey, from the top down, this is what you're going to do or how it will look, why don't you try and influence the system and the environment and the conditions that themselves then shape people's interactions? Because by shaping the interactions you want to see more of or less of, culture starts to emerge from that. So if you set the environment up in which people can prioritize well-being, well-being is more likely to be prioritized. But simply telling people to prioritize well-being without doing anything to change the conditions, you're never going to get there. Never going to get there.
I've got 100 more questions, Alethea.
Yeah, right. I do. I've got one for me, but it's more like am I getting this right? So is it almost as if we can almost say that the organization itself has a sense of well-being as well as its people, and they operate together? Because I think the way I usually think about this is more thinking about culture and values, but I've never kind of gone before to think, no, actually the organization needs in itself has a state of well-being, and we need to look honestly at what that is and respond to what that is, but that is made up of the people.
Yeah, and I think it's about moving away from this idea, because we talk about organizations as if they are one, right? So you say, what is the organizational culture like? And there is no one organizational culture. There's no one sense of how the organization is doing. What there are thousands upon thousands of micro cultures that are constantly coming together, disappearing as you interact in and out of different meetings, environments, and conditions, right? So if you're at the executive level, and you've got a great dynamic because you probably can control your diary every single day, then your well-being and your culture will be one thing. If you're at the ground floor and you're dealing with, request after request coming in, it's going to be very, very different. And I think there's been a real shift. What I've picked up on is an appreciation of the importance of culture. These unwritten values, beliefs, and attitudes that people hold, but a recognition that it's actually really hard to change culture, right? It is, imagine the values we have that have really been shaped over the past however many decades we've been alive and the experiences we've had. The idea that I'm going to start an organization and they're going to tell me now what my new values should be seems absolutely crazy, right? I just cannot imagine how to do that. And so there's been a move away, not away from, but saying, hey, culture is important, but we're probably better off focusing less on the culture and more on the climate. And the climate is what actually shows up for workers. It's what they see in their leaders. And, you know, Enron is the best example of an organization that had values being espoused. You know, integrity was one of Enron's major values. And yet the things that showed up every day were not integrity. So how do you, as an organization, as leaders, get much clearer on what do we expect to see show up in your behaviors, your decisions, your priorities? And those are things we should be able to observe and hold people to account on in a positive way, not how do I tell you what values you should have or what you should believe. Some people will believe actually that safety isn't as important as productivity, right? That's just that's not right or wrong. It's just a belief they have. I would rather spend less time trying to convince them that safety and well-being should be valued more than productivity if they don't tick that way. I'd much rather have a conversation that says, yeah, but when you get a business case up from someone saying you should invest in your people's well-being and it's going to cost you this, or you're going to make a little bit more profit, hey, as an organization, we expect you to choose the well-being intervention over the profit. Like that shows up. It shows up as a decision. It's tangible. That, to me, that climate focused stuff is more powerful than having leaders talk about how much they care about well-being. And yet every time a business case comes up saying, can you invest just a little bit? They say, sorry, I can't do that. It might eat into our profits. Like that's the disconnect between climate and culture. And me personally, I spend more of my time saying, how do we shift the climate? What do we expect to see and show up? And then culture will start to, by its very nature, emerge from that. Because if people see their leader making decisions that do decisions that do prioritize well-being, the culture will shift by its very nature, because they'll start to have a deeper belief that well-being matters in this organization, because I can see it. It doesn't always flow the opposite way in my experience.
Yeah.
So can I ask you about your role then? So in your role, you said you're responsible for shifting the climate. Obviously, part of that will be understanding the climate and what's going on. You said that you have regular conversations with, the finance director and so on. So not maybe like what's a day in the life of, but what do you spend your time doing, in your role, if it's not putting on wellbeing weeks, but it's influencing the system?
Yeah, it's great. So look, I'm really fortunate that I joined an organization 5.5 years ago that's genuinely committed to improving health, safety, and well-being of its people. And we have 11,000 employees. We also, though, manage and look after 40,000 prisoners and community-based offenders. And from a safety perspective, my remit covers them as well, because they are often undertaking really high-risk work. We have construction yards and forestry operations. We have industrial kitchens and laundries and manufacturing sites that our prisoners actually operate, and we supervise them to give them vocational skills. So that's a big area of interest of mine. So I joined about 5.5 years ago. I joined at a point where there were 6 health and safety advisors for an organization that is probably one of the highest risk. And since then, we've grown to a team of about 72. So we've gone on a real journey of investment. That team is made up of, I've got a great director of strategy and systems who supports me to build the kind of organizational frameworks. Got an amazing business partnering team that have well-being professionals, injury management professionals, safety advisors. And then I've got a data insights and kind of assurance and learning team. So because I've got such an amazing team around me, it almost frees me up as the Chief Safety and Wellbeing Officer to actually not have to spend a huge amount of my time down and in trying to say, how do we do safety and wellbeing? Because I've got an amazing team who do that day in, day out. So I think I probably spend about 50% of my time saying, how do I give those people the resources they need, open the doors, make the connections if they need them to help them do the amazing work they do. But then I'd probably say 50-60% of my time is actually helping to run the organization with other members of the exec, recognizing that if I can nudge the way that they think about running the organization towards a position where safety and well-being is more likely, then I achieve my goals in a very indirect way. So I spend a lot of my time in governance forums and governance committees. So, investment committee, our organizational performance committee, spending time really scrutinizing where are we trying to get to as a business, working in a very hard, complex system. Where are we trying to get to? Where are we now? What's the plan to move between the two states? And then how are we nudging things like where we're strategically going to invest, where we need to grow leaders, or how do we prepare ourselves and create a greater level of organizational resilience for big shock events like a cyclone, like a pandemic, like the Great Resignation. And because I see safety and well-being as outcomes of how the organization operates, increasingly I spend more of my time being really curious about how ready and prepared the organization is to be able to keep doing its work safe and well in the face of those big shock events. So we have a cyclone. How prepared are we for a cyclone hitting us so that our people are safe and well during those events? We have a pandemic hitting us. How prepared are we to actually manage the risk of an infectious disease? We have the Great Resignation hit us. How prepared is our business to be able to do its stuff well when it's got 40% fewer staff at the front line? And so more of my time has been really curious about how does the organization actually prepare itself to operate in a resilient way? And then increasingly, how do we learn from those things? What's gone well, what's gone not well? What would we do differently next time for continuous improvement? So a lot of my role is actually not in the detail of the safety and well-being, because I've got amazing people who help me do that. It's actually much more about organizational resilience, because safety and well-being are outcomes of the system being able to continue to operate well during really shock event type scenarios.
It sounds a bit like preventative health, but for an organization. I guess we would take that approach for ourselves, right? We're moving more into preventative health rather than being reactive, and it's kind of sounding like that, but on behalf of the organization as a whole.
Yeah, there's a great book, again, it's in the safety space, but there's a movement that started the early 2000s called resilience engineering. And again, it was in this mindset that safety is an outcome of a system of complexity. And therefore, because of complexity is always about unexpected things happening, you can't just write perfect rules that will always help you get to an outcome. So rather than just saying, let's write lots of rules, the movement said, let's create the ability to anticipate what could happen in the future, to monitor which of those scenarios is becoming more or less likely, to respond really quickly and effectively in the moment when that scenario actually hits you, and then to learn so that you can improve your ability to anticipate in the future. So it's absolutely about prevention. It's very much about being in touch with what's happening. It's about being able to recognize it and then react and respond in the right way to get the right outcomes, but then reflecting and learning. And you can apply that at an individual level. You can apply it at an organizational level. You can apply it at a national level. But the themes feel very common to me. Prevent, monitor, respond and react effectively, and then learn and improve as you move forwards.
And amazing to hear you've got that big team as well.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask about that. Look, I don't think it's, well, is it typical in New Zealand or where you're based or the organizations that you've worked in to have someone with chief and well-being in their title at the same time, working with the exec team, on the exec team?
I'm seeing a few more. So there are a few chief wellbeing officers that I see popping up around. There was a point where I started to see a few chief happiness officers popping up around. And I will say, I'm sure I'm going to wind some people up now. I'm glad that I saw those and then they disappeared, because I think if we're tying wellbeing just back to happiness, then we probably missed the mark somewhere. And I'm sure I'll get some messages about why I've got that wrong.
Yeah, you've just alienated our chief happiness officers on our watches.
Absolutely. So I am seeing a few more chief wellbeing officers, but I do think one of the challenges is both from the people at the kind of demand side, so the executive demanding to be serviced with good wellbeing advice. I still think that they, unfortunately and wrongly, still see the wellbeing profession as being a bit too fluffy, a bit too nebulous and hard to pin down, and are nice to have to the side of the business, as opposed to being what the business is about. So I think there's a demand issue. And I think there is also a bit, not everywhere, but sometimes a bit of a supply issue as well, which is I think that some wellbeing leaders themselves are still in that space. not all. One of the things I've been most pleased about over the past decade actually is that is shifting massively, and more people are changing their mindset about what well-being at work really is. But I think both the supply and the demand sides need to probably reorient themselves to what it could be if they can actually get well-being to be seen as a genuine strategic imperative, not as a add-on that's nice to have because everyone should have a well-being agenda, but actually what we're about. And what's really good, our chief executive here, he's been working on his kind of updated vision for a while, and he has put the organizational mission is now about the capability, safety, and well-being of our workforce. So we are here to, one of the things we're here to do is to create wellness and well-being of people. And when we talk about people, we mean the people that we manage and look after. The core role, one of the core roles of an effective corrections system is to reduce the likelihood that someone who's in it now will come back in the future. And we do that by investing in their well-being, their ability to live a fulfilling life after they have left the corrections system. So for the past few years, we've been very, very focused on how do we shift our focus into the wellness and well-being of the people that we manage and look after. And explicitly at the same time, he's coming out and saying, but actually we need to start with the safety, well-being, and capability of our workforce, because if they're safe and well, then they will deliver the wellness and well-being of the people they look after. But if we jump too far to the wellness and well-being of the people we look after, and our people don't feel safe and well, then actually we've left them behind. So, I think when you get a chief executive who genuinely gets it and sees well-being as actually the core organizational purpose that delivers performance, that delivers productivity, then suddenly your job as a chief well-being officer just becomes infinitely easier because the door is always open.
Okay, it's a bit of a tangent, really, and I will get back on track to your role a bit more specifically about your role, because I'd love to hear about kind of what you felt helped you get to where you got to. But just on that last point, do you think, I guess I'm asking you to speculate a little bit, but do you think there's certain industries where that's more difficult to do? So, if I was going to, it's not playing devil's advocate, but challenge in a way, you work for the Department of Corrections, which is, I'm guessing, is it publicly run over there? Or?
Yeah, it's
the public sector organization, and the safety of people is, you could see how that makes sense, and you're talking about the fact that plays straight into the productivity, which is obviously a goal of your organization as well. But what about a retail organization? What about a financial services organization, for example, where people, they may say people are the most important asset, but profit is the most important asset to a certain extent sometimes. Do you think it's more difficult in certain industries or not?
I think it's difficult in all industries. So even though I can, I can pithily say it's like this in our organization, no, we still have, performance targets to hit. So, it is hard, and it's a bit of a paradox, right? Rather than a dilemma, it's a paradox that on one hand, we want to do all the right things we can to maximize the safety and well-being of people. And yet sometimes the things that maximize the safety and well-being of people directly impact our ability to perform and be profitable, right? Sometimes to be safe, we have to say you can't actually run the business as lean as you want to and just generate all the money that you want. Sometimes for people to be well, you can't run them into the ground, even though actually them working 70 hours a week might generate much greater productivity at a lower cost for you. So there is a bit of a paradox there. But I think increasingly organizations, particularly with the emergence of the ESG agenda, organizations are actually starting to recognize that actually profit is not the sole reason why organizations exist. Because if profit was the sole reason, then it drives you towards short-term focus, right? And many very profitable organizations have gone under because the focus was profit. And the move towards sustainability as an agenda, actually, how does the organization sustain itself? How does the organization contribute back to the community? How does it become more of a social stakeholder? I think is increasingly shifting the focus for those who govern organizations towards a broader agenda. So moving it away from a shareholder agenda, how do I give the best payback to shareholders, and much more towards a stakeholder agenda, where you're actually being more focused on what are all of the needs of the people who have a stake in this organization. And some of the most important people who have a stake in this organization are the people who work in that organization. And so I think increasingly I'm seeing the mindset shift away from shareholder primacy, it's all about giving money back and profit, and increasingly towards stakeholder primacy. Who are our stakeholders? What are their sometimes divergent needs? And how do we balance those things out most? And then you can, Matt, get into, and again, you, myself, and Kerry used to talk about this. You can then start to also say, regardless of all of that great ESG stuff, actually, if you have people who are well, they're at work more often, being productive, being engaged, delivering the stuff you need, raising your brand in the way you want. So if you view safety and wellbeing as a driver of organizational performance, then you start to move away from the mindset of this or that, and you see it as an and conversation rather than an either or. So we want performance and we want safety and wellbeing, because safety and wellbeing drives performance as a virtuous cycle.
Yeah, that is fascinating. That's where I wanted to get to. Yeah, that's absolutely. I don't know if you've come across, I forget what the research is called, but the theory of donut economics. Have you heard of this? No. So it's in the, you should have a look. It's in the world of sustainability. It's not well-being per se, but it essentially the definition is there's a donut of sustainability, whereby if you overreach as a society, so this economics, it's about societal economics, but if you overreach, it leads to bad outcomes, right? Pollution and all the rest of it. But at the other end, if there's not enough investment in certain areas, then it leads to poverty. And there's almost like this thin slither of the perfect balance in the middle, and that's similar to what you've described there. Is unless I've understood correctly, your role seems to be, how do we make sure we're in that donut, we're getting the balance right between those two things, and it can be that virtuous cycle almost works, right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So did we want to ask about the role? That's fascinating. We could do a whole podcast on that whole piece there. As you can tell, I'm very interested in all that. Alethea knows. Should we ask you about your role in terms of what, so you've mentioned the steps that you took to get to where you got to. What do you think's helped you along the way in terms of, I don't know, like personal characteristics or transitions that you've made, or have you had a good mentor, or what helped you get to where you were?
What's it helped me? One of the things I've become increasingly more comfortable with in the past few years is this concept of being a vulnerable leader, right? So actually being much more comfortable to talk about, and humility and vulnerability don't mean, pretending that you're rubbish at everything, which some people do. It's like, humility means I'm really comfortable with the stuff I'm good at. I'm really comfortable talking about the stuff I'm not good at. And 10 years ago, Matt, when you and I were working together, I definitely wasn't a vulnerable leader. And I look back and there's lots of reasons why. So what's helped me get to where I am and what are the things I've been working on? I think I do think there's something in the need to be constantly curious. I personally think that is a hallmark of an effective leader, is to be constantly curious, wanting to learn, wanting to know more, not taking the simple answer as the right one and just using a soundbite, but actually getting under what sits behind that. Is that true? And I think that curiosity has really helped me, because what it's meant is that as I'm curious about more and more and more things, as the ring kind of expands, it means the nature of the conversations I've been able to have moved into the executive level very, very rapidly, as opposed to saying in a very narrow technical field. And so I think for me, that curiosity about, well, actually, how do organizations run? What's it like being a chief finance officer who's got to worry about the P&L? What is it like being an operations leader who actually has got all of these competing demands? So I think curiosity is really important, alongside humility. I think that's pretty cool. I recognize in myself, I'm a fairly naturally systems and strategy kind of person. So some people are amazing doers. They can take a thing and they can do it and see it through to completion. That's not me. I'm not a starter finisher guy. I'm very much an ideas, vision, where can we get to guy, and I think that's been really helpful for me. And I like to think I'm a pretty good communicator. I can waffle on at times, but I'm pretty good at articulating. And again, that's been really helpful, because it means I've been able to communicate different agendas or different needs to people in ways that meet what they need to hear, rather than having one way of talking or one way of communicating, which talks to one person in the room, but probably alienates the remaining 10 people. So those things have been really good. I think my personal kind of the vulnerable bit is I've had to work really hard on leadership. I became a senior leader very young. You know, I was leading 100 people by the time I was 26. That was incredible. And I made so many mistakes as a leader, and I continue to unfortunately make so many mistakes as a leader. But for me in the past few years, actually that comfort, almost the freeing nature of talking openly about what I find naturally hard and what I'm not good at, has actually almost accelerated the next part of my career journey, because suddenly it means that I no longer feel under lots of pressure to be perfect, to get everything right, you know, or when something goes wrong, to feel like I've failed, which I used to feel massively, and instead say, yeah, that's right. I'm not great at that thing. How can you help me? You know, it's been very freeing. So I think the attributes bit are I've got strengths I think have played into this space, but I've been increasingly comfortable actually talking about the stuff that has historically held me back, and that I've become more and more comfortable acknowledging and being really open with people about, hey, yeah, I made a mistake. This failed. One of the things I tried with my wider leadership team, there's probably about 15 or so people leaders beneath me, is once a month at our leadership team meeting, we would start by talking about the biggest mistake we made in the last month. So not what's our biggest achievement, but what went wrong. And I always went first, but it was a really nice way of freeing up the conversation from the very start of the day about your boss, me. I'm going to tell you about this big cock up I made last month, and let's have a joke about it. Because if you can see me making mistakes, hey, it becomes a lot easier for you to talk about what you've done wrong or what's going hard for you. So there's some of the things. I've probably gone well off tangent, but there's some of the things I reflect back on attribute wise that I think have helped me get to this point of being a chief officer at a relatively young age.
Right. Funnily enough, one of our questions is, what has gone wrong? Is there something you can tell us about? It might be more practical, like a piece of work or an initiative or something you thought your, workforce needed, but turned out they didn't. Can you give us an example?
Yeah, probably quite a few. Look, I think one of them actually, Matt, it goes back to that discussion about setting out the strategy for Network Rail 10 years ago, and I think you look at it and it sounds like a really compelling document, and I look back now and I just think how naive and overly aspirational it was. So one of the big lessons for me has been what did I do wrong in there? I actually didn't really at that point fully understand what strategy was. I've spent the last 10 years kind of trying to get to grips with it. And what went wrong is massively set out a thing that sounded like this idealistic view of what the world would be, to a workforce that actually spent most of their time working in really hard, cold weather, overnight, fixing, sleepers on the railway, moving heavy things. And so for me, it was, we talk a lot about strategic context and strategic fit, which is matching your strategy to the context of the organization and the realities, not being bound by those things. You've got to set out an aspirational vision, but matching it to the context. And so one of the biggest things I have often done is I have failed at those times to really understand the strategic context, which has meant that the strategy has felt a bit pie in the sky type stuff. So that's definitely one thing. I look back on that, and like I said, it's great that the strategy has endured through some slight iterations from what I can see. But I do look back and I think I could have done that strategy so much better. I could have co-designed it so much better with the people at the front line. So
yeah, you didn't manage to predict the pandemic, I imagine.
No, I was definitely not there. But
yeah, my point is there's only so much we can strategize anyway, right? Because stuff's going to happen.
well, that's it. I think again, going wildly off topic, strategy I think is increasingly moving away from what we've seen as strategy of, we want to get from A to Z and here's our perfect plan of getting there, and instead we want to get from here to roughly over there, and here's a bunch of scenarios that we're mapping out now, and we're going to course correct as we see the scenarios starting to come in. So the idea now that it's even like, what is the point of setting out a 10-year strategy in what we call a VUCA, this volatile, massively uncertain environment where actually we don't know what the major, political, economic scenario is going to be next year? Why set out a 10-year strategy when you could just set out a rough direction of the future, and actually you're building plans in the moment that are taking you closer and closer towards it through scenario-based thinking? So,
in your defense of that, certainly the work that we did at Network Rail, it's hard to make it very human centered and to design it around the individual. The one thing that always struck me, and it's not just with Network Rail, with other organizations I've worked with, but that's a good example. There's such a wide variety of roles, you know, from someone sat in a fancy office in central London right through to, as you said, someone working in the middle of the night on a track on their own, you know, in the pitch black. You know, that's maybe not in the pitch black, that's a safety hazard, but you know what I mean, you know, real kind of such difference between the workforce and how you create a strategy that suits the needs of all those individuals is
but I think it's in that, Matt. And again, this is one of the big things that I really took from you and Kerry when we used to chat was we were talking about how do you do stress risk assessments at the time, right? This idea, and right now there are organizations who still aren't doing that, and you know, we're on the journey. How do you do a really good organizational stress risk assessment? And at the time, it was like, do you just do a survey or do you just do this direct thing? And I think it's the recognition that you need both, right? So you need an organizational approach, whether it's a stress risk assessment or a strategy. The organization needs to know where it's going, and you need to focus on the big system changes that will make that more likely. And at the same time, you cannot anticipate the needs of every individual worker or team. So you have to equip the leaders of that team and that person to be able to also be empowered to do their little bit to actually maneuver their organizational system. So if you imagine it's only going to be solved by the organizational strategy, you're going to fail because you cannot appreciate the richness of the individual context. Or if you say, oh, there's no point in having an organizational strategy, we'll just empower the frontline leaders to do what they think is right, then everyone's heading off in a million different directions. So it's almost like you've got to point the direction, you've got to focus on a few big levers in the system, and then you've got to actually say, how do we empower and equip leaders to actually know their local context and support them to be able to make the decisions that work for them and their people, often by freeing them up with resources and time and not giving them goal conflicts. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I've taken us back onto strategy again. I was going to ask, there was a question that came up. There was a question that came to my mind. You talked about the changes that you've made. Well, I had two questions actually. I'll tell you what, I'll ask the first one quickly. You talked about the becoming more humility, growing, and curiosity, and all the rest. Was there a moment when that happened in your mind?
Yeah, there was.
Why did that happen?
It was a few years ago. We'd done a bit of a diagnostic here in my team, and you know, the diagnostic came back that said, look, people aren't happy, and as ever, you know, recognizing there's a million reasons why people are and aren't happy in an organization. I tend to wear it very heavily. I always personally feel like it's a Chris, you're failing. So I did a bit of reflection, and I read a great book. Like, there's loads of books, right? But there's a guy called Patrick Lencioni who I quite like. You know, most of his stuff. And he wrote a book, I think it's something called like The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And it really spoke to like, here's why teams go wrong. And I was like, oh my God, I'm doing all of those things, you know, I'm doing, and it was written in a great way. And that made me go, oh, actually, you need to get really comfortable with the idea that you are setting a team up in a way that is not enabling it to succeed. And I went on and listened to about all of his I think he's up to about 140 podcasts. I listened to loads of them. And it was almost like another light bulb moment for me, but on a personal level of vulnerability, because he starts his 5 dysfunctions with, if you are not being vulnerable, if you're not getting comfortable with what you're not naturally good at, where you're making mistakes, nothing else works from a team level. And for me, that was almost like the big light bulb of, am I genuinely being vulnerable to myself and to the team? And the answer was no, I wasn't. For I had big imposter syndrome and a bunch of other stuff going on, and that actually was the light bulb moment. And I just started really working hard over a period of time to try and be actively vulnerable, and it was really uncomfortable. I hated it for quite a while, and then it became increasingly easier as you just get used to it. And so I'd say, yeah, it's probably about 3 or 4 years ago now, Matt, that I kind of went through that myself and was like, yeah, vulnerability is where it starts.
Yeah, nice one. So I did link onto my other question. So I was going to ask you about the activities that you've done to help you in your career. So earlier in the discussion, right at the start, you mentioned that you did a course in, was it organizational wellbeing? You said there's been some books that have had a big impact on you, podcasts. What are the sorts of activities that you do and you would, I guess, advise may be helpful for other people to progress their roles?
I certainly think learning more about how an organization runs. So I've completed an MBA as well. And I think, you know, having that knowledge of what does it mean to actually have to, what are the fundamentals of financial management, or what about strategic operations management? What does it look like to actually run the operations? I think studying and being curious about organizations and what it takes to run them, I think I would absolutely advocate that wellbeing professionals should step out of their technical domain and instead undertake activities that help them to understand at a conceptual or practical level what it's like to run a business. So a lot of what I read these days is actually not about well-being. It's not about safety. It's about things like institutional logics, like how does an organization sustain itself over time? It's actually much more about how do I think about strategy. If you've got a chief strategy officer, what it's like to be them. So for me, a lot of my activities have been focused less about developing my technical knowledge in safety and well-being, and much more about organizations and how they operate, and then from organizations into actually ecosystems, and actually starting to see, well, how do nations come about? How do countries interact? So for me, one of the biggest things I'd strongly advocate and that I have found really helpful is don't be constantly curious about the latest well-being fad. Be really curious about what it's like to be a chief finance officer, or to be a chief executive, or to be a board director, and just think about what it must be like and the challenges they've got, and try and understand some of the detail that sits behind it, so that when you go in and talk to them, you're conversing in a much different language, but you're a much broader leader for that.
That is really interesting, because I've spoken to a huge amount of wellbeing leaders over the years, and quite rightly, sometimes you can feel a little bit like, the organization just don't get me, right? And the chief finance officer just doesn't get me, doesn't get well-being. They don't get it. The question could be, well, do you get finance? Right? Do you understand that? Do you empathize with them in the same way that you want them to empathize with you?
But it also means you create a much different value proposition, because you move away from being someone who is there to talk about this narrow thing to suddenly someone who actually becomes the dot joiner amongst everyone's conversations. So suddenly you're able to step into an investment committee meeting, look at 10 investment papers and say, the common theme I'm seeing from all of these is X. And X is actually potentially going to put our broader well-being agenda or performance agenda or safety agenda at risk. Why don't we talk about X? Are we really happy with that? And actually that ability, and this is where I think wellbeing professionals do help, because many wellbeing professionals I've encountered, by their very nature, seem to have a systems brain to them. They're very good at joining dots. They tend to think about, the connection between mind and body and spirituality and food. Those things are systems, right? You are talking about the relationships between things. So if you take someone who's a natural systems person and say, stop focusing on your bit and now go and try and join the dots of these other things that the organization is doing, your value proposition as a leader just changes infinitely. And no longer are you, hey, we're going to wheel you in and out to come and talk about well-being for 10 minutes because it matters. Hey, suddenly you're going to be a core member of this group, and we're not going to ask you to wear the well-being hat. We're going to ask you to wear the strategic hat that helps us see the commonalities across our agenda. Now that, as a well-being professional, is just such a different value proposition to where I think many are right now, which can sometimes still be, I'm about this agenda. And I think that's what's sometimes limiting to us.
Really good, really good. Look, we're nearly out of time. Alethea, have you got a final question maybe?
I do. I don't know if it just takes us in a different direction. But it's actually going right back to the beginning of you telling us about your journey and your time with Nuffield Health and Ollie.
Yeah.
And Ollie's principles that kind of helped shift your thinking from health in a more sort of medical way to something broader, which was well-being. What were those principles? So I think this is a challenge for people generally, for society. Like, we can't properly define well-being in our minds, even if we can read a definition. What were those principles?
It was less of a principle. So what Ollie shared with us was a model that had been around, I think it was first created in like the 70s or 80s, called the illness wellness continuum, So it was this spectrum that kind of shows a spectrum, and at one end you've got preventable ill health, and in the midpoint you've got this point where a person is absent from ill health, right? You go to the doctor, cholesterol's fine, weight is fine, everything is fine. And what Ollie was depicting to us was graphically, and I'm a pictures guy, so it worked, was, hey, this is the traditional medical model of health. You are unwell until you're a point where you're not well, or you're not well and you go the opposite way. And a doctor is there trying to distinguish if you've yet got any signs that you're heading towards this preventable ill health. And the illness wellness continuum, what was really powerful is it expanded out the other way. And it said, hey, you can be sat in the middle without any discernible ill health or signs and symptoms of a pathology developing, but you can have a low libido, you don't sleep well, you don't feel energized on a daily basis, you don't feel connected to the people around you. Is that genuinely well-being? Does that genuinely feel like what we describe as someone who has well-being? And it's a really powerful depiction of, oh, you're right, actually, everything that I've done historically has kind of been weighted towards a model of use exercise so you don't gain weight, use exercise to, you know, reverse elements of your cardiovascular disease, not how do I think about how you feel on a daily basis, how you function on a daily basis. And so for me, that was a real eye-opener. And suddenly you then move into, when you're at the well-being at an individual level, you move away from, we're just about how do I prevent ill health or reverse signs of ill health. And suddenly you become about how do I help you to function well? And that functionality aspect really hit home. Is, oh my God, I can have a conversation with someone about their libido and think about how actually their exercise, their nutrition, their sleep, their recovery affects that, or their sleep, or their cognitive function on a daily basis, the mind, you know, kind of fogginess that comes in. I can have a conversation with someone about well-being influencing that, or the lifestyle. And so that for me was really helpful. And Ollie is continuing to be one of the probably the leaders in the world in this space. But that really hit home for me, and it just suddenly allowed me to see the world in a very different light. And it moved it away from binary, you're this or you're that, towards a more broad spectrum. And if I'm honest, you know, we've kind of moved on from then. So you've got this dual continuum model now that kind of distinguishes health from well-being on different axes. So you can have poor health, and yet you can also still have good well-being. And Matt, this is what you and Kerry helped me understand is, you know, well-being is this subjective sense of how I am, this, you know, this state of eudaimonic kind of well-being. You know, do I have a strong sense of purpose? And then hedonic, do I feel good? Do I have a regular positive affect, etc.? You know, you can have those things and still suffer from diabetes. So the illness wellness continuum kind of made it sound like those things are opposing. You can't have ill health and also have well-being. The dual continuum model allowed you to go, you can have diabetes and still have good well-being. You can have cancer and have good well-being, or conversely, no ill health and really poor well-being. And I think since then, you know, so that was really helpful. And then starting to see it again as emergent. So I think it's using mental models like that as a well-being professional guide your way of viewing the world, which then guides your practice and ultimately then guides how you add value back to individuals or to organizations. And Nuffield Health for me was like the light bulb moment of realizing that, and Ollie in particular.
Great.
Yeah, amazing.
Nice. Great place to finish, I think. Like I said, I could keep talking to you forever, but I'm sure you've got things that you're just starting out your day. It's last thing at night for me and Alethea, but yeah, you're just starting out your day. So thank you so much for your time today. I guess the final question would be, you know, where can our audience find you? I'm guessing you're on LinkedIn. Have you got anything you want to plug? Some people want to plug something, but I guess maybe not.
No, not a plugger. No, not a plugger. Yeah, look, I'm on LinkedIn. It tends to be really the only place I tend to do those sorts of things. So people want to connect, I'm on LinkedIn. I do tend to have a tendency to post thought bubbles that pop into my brain every once in a while that I like to have good chats with people about. So if anyone wants to connect that way, then very happy to.
Perfect.
Amazing. I feel like we'd love to come back to you at some point as well to hear a bit about this work and in New Zealand and on that side of the world. You know, that's sort of something we want to get to, is to definitely have like a good global community and see what things are looking like in different markets. So that would be my remaining question, just to come back to you on that, if that's okay.
I'm sure you and Matt can somehow figure out a journey over to New Zealand at some point.
Oh, yeah.
Setting up a business trip.
That sounds good.
Yeah. I'm up for that. Well, thank you very much for your time, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks,
Thank you.
Alicia. Thanks.
Cheers. See ya.
Bye.
See ya.